Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today I want to continue our discussion on the quintessential quintuplets. More specifically, I want to talk about the void that the five girls have in their lives and how this void has impacted their personalities, interactions, and mental health. Before I get into things, however, I want to provide a brief spoiler warning. I will be getting into spoilers for the entire series, so if you don't want the quintessential quintuplets spoiled for you, I would click away. Now, where to begin? Well, first things first, I want to state the obvious and clarify that this void was caused by the death of their mother, and the void is quite literally the place in their lives that their mother used to occupy. There is a clear line drawn between how the quintuplets were before her death and after. The quintuplets were happier, albeit poorer, during the time they had with their mother, and they all got along so well that it was almost like they were synchronized with each other, and they were basically the most identical they were in their lives. The death of any parent will have a massive impact on their children, and it would be difficult to list every way that this death could have impacted them. Therefore, for the purposes of this video, I will be focusing on just two. The first one is that the death of their mother seems to have disrupted the harmony between the quintuplets. Basically, this isn't manifested immediately, but they start to bicker and fight more as they start to sort of change due to the death of their mother and also due to all the changes in their lives that came after this, which eventually starts to have more and more of an effect the sort of further things go on. The second one is that her absence caused them to slip behind on their schoolwork. Considering that their mother was highly intelligent and literally a teacher, I have a hard time believing that they would be struggling as much if they still had her influence in their lives. It's not as black and white, so you can't say, oh, well, they were perfect students before and now they are awful students, but still, it's worth noting that her influence sort of had to have had some impact had she still been around. This one seems smaller, but within the context of the story, it's actually super important. Basically, their struggles in school directly caused some of the conflicts that occur between the sisters and also eventually led to them meeting Futuro. Futuro not only filled the void left by their mother, but he also unfortunately served as a source of a lot of conflict between the quintuplets as they adjusted to their new lives and matured, etc. Now, before we can take a look at the way that this void impacted each of the quintuplets, there's one final thing we need to consider. So, here's the thing. I can't fully tell if the story wants us to see the quintuplets' mother as a tragic saint or low-key a horrible mother. Because the thing is, she gives the quintuplets this one piece of wisdom, and I can't help but feel like it did more harm than good. And in general, it seems like a weird thing for a mother to tell her children. The exact quote from this is that Mom always used to say, if one of you makes a mistake, overcome it together. If one of you is happy, share it with the others. Love, anger, sorrow, joy are shared among the five of us in 5 equal parts. So if I were to write a thesis on the quintessential quintuplets, my main argument would be that the entire story is about the quintuplets sort of being harmed by this advice and ultimately learning to overcome it and let go of it. Basically, ever since they lost their mother, it feels like they have subconsciously / sort of consciously clung to this advice, but ultimately this advice doesn't work in the real world and it causes them a lot of distress. So this is why I'm not sure if we should view the mother as being a good influence or not. The quintuplets never seem to really question this. It's not like partway through the story they realize their mom was a bad mom or anything like that. And that sort of makes me think that the anime wants us to think that she was a good mom, but we see that this sort of advice causes so much pain, which makes me feel conflicted about it. And it's worth noting that I feel like Ichika and Miku probably suffer the most from this advice, but people like Itsuki sort of keep implementing that advice and adding pressure, which then kind of forces Miku and Ichika to sort of push back against that, and it causes a divide between the sisters. So even if the quintuplet isn't specifically feeling the pressure of this quote, but their application of it into their relationship with their sisters still causes some divide. But with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at how this void impacted each of the quintuplets. So first we have Ichika. Ichika seems to have had a bit of an existential crisis after her mother dies. She feels like she isn't special and doesn't have a thing, so she starts to pursue acting. And she's ultimately successful with acting, but before the success came, she was under an immense amount of pressure to make herself useful and feel worthy enough of standing next to her sisters. Furthermore, she serves as an interesting foil to Miku when it comes to Miku's emotional crisis. I would argue that Ichika and Miku are the most negatively impacted by the advice of sharing everything. Ichika, ultimately, in the face of this sort of void and the pressure of this advice, feels like she needs to play the role of the big sister and sacrifice her own happiness for that of her younger sisters. As a result, she fails to make a confident move on Futaro until it's too late, and that causes her a lot of distress. Miku is probably the most harmed by her mother's advice. She is arguably the first to fully realize that she has feelings for Futaro. However, since she feels like they need to share everything, she feels like she can't ask Futaro to be in an exclusive relationship with her. He is everyone's tutor, so she feels like any sort of romantic connection would take him away from her sisters, and that wouldn't be fair, and it would be going against her mother's wishes. Ultimately, she's able to overcome this advice and decides to fight for Futaro, and decides that it's better to look at what is fair versus equal. But this advice from her mother still sort of haunts her for much of the narrative, and it's one of the main things she sort of struggles with. Nino sort of reacts to the void by trying to keep things how they were. She struggles the most with adapting to all of the change in the quintuplets' lives, and she's sort of constantly fighting with her sisters and fighting with Futaro because she just desperately wants to go back to how things were. And whenever one of the quintuplets starts to become more unique, she sees that as them changing from how they were when their mother was still alive, and she resists that a lot. And it isn't until she's really able to overcome this sort of almost Gatsby-esque pursuit of the past that she's able to sort of start to be happy and sort of mature and grow as a character. But it's definitely the biggest obstacle for her. Yotsuba's biggest struggle is her own self-neglect due to a low self-esteem. She neglects her own well-being and allows her sisters to pursue Futaro since she feels like she doesn't deserve him. Even after he confesses to her, she still doesn't feel like she is quote-unquote worthy enough. Now, this type of emotional struggle is complex, and it can't necessarily be pinned down to one root cause. However, the story highlights that a big source of this lack of self-esteem is her struggles in school. She made a promise to Futaro 5 years before the story begins that, they're both going to do better in school so they can make their families' lives easier. Futaro succeeds in his education, but Yotsuba quickly struggles and gives up. As a result, the Quints have to leave their school, and Yotsuba fights with her sisters, sort of as a way of avoiding the truth, and sort of she lashes out, let's say, and she pushes away her schoolwork even more, which just makes things worse. And then, when she meets Futaro again, she feels unworthy of his affection since she failed in her promise. It's worth noting that this promise was made to help her family, which brings up once again the shadow of her mother. This is only further complicated by the fact that her mother was a highly intelligent scholar, and therefore her struggles with her education feel all the more painful, when it comes to sort of comparing herself to her mother, since they all looked up to their mother. Itsuki copes with the death of her mother by trying to effectively fill the void herself. Narratively, Futaro sort of fills the void. It's not that he perfectly fills the void of the mother, but he sort of makes a new puzzle piece, and he becomes the rock for the quintuplets to lean on, and he ultimately serves as a positive influence. Itsuki, however, tries to literally be her mother and sort of serve that role for the quintuplets. This ultimately results in some negative moments, like when she slaps Nino across the face and causes a massive fight. Furthermore, I still remain a bit conflicted about the fact that Itsuki never quite leaves the shadow of her mother and that she ultimately becomes a teacher. It just feels like Itsuki actually has different passions than her mother, but feels like she has to be studious and become a teacher since that's what her mother did. I feel like she would have been happier as like a food critic or something like that. And I was really expecting a moment of growth where she realizes that she doesn't have to copy her mother, but that never comes. So the sort of too long didn't read version is the quintuplets' mother's death greatly impacted the quintuplets and left a void in their lives. This void impacted each of them in a unique way. Ichika has an existential crisis and neglects herself due to her big sister complex. Miku is weighed down by the advice their mother gave them and struggles with not wanting to share everything despite feeling like she must. Nino tries to keep things the way they were, and once things change, she tries to effectively return to the past. It's only after she's able to move on and adapt to the change that she's able to find happiness and stability. Yotsuba neglects herself out of a lack of self-worth, and I think this low self-esteem has to do with the fact that she's struggling in school so much and that her mother was a highly intelligent scholar, who was also struggling financially. Itsuki ultimately copes by trying to become her mother. I wish we saw her overcome this sense of obligation, but ultimately she stays on this path. But yeah, that's going to conclude today's video. I sort of just wanted to talk about how the shadow of the quintuplets' mother sort of looms over all the quintuplets, and we can sort of analyze the story and see how each of the sisters sort of represents a different way that shadow sort of impacts them. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. If you kind of like this content, I'd love to hear that because I'm hoping to make more stuff like this. The last couple of videos have sort of been in this format and I like it a lot more, but let me know your thoughts. And, you know, if you interpreted the different sisters in a different way from me, I'd love to hear how you sort of read and interpret them and sort of what your own analysis is. But that being said, I'm going to wrap things up. So thank you again and take care.